Welcome to the latest episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this episode, we're going to discuss Taglit-Birthright Israel and how it engages young Jewish people with the state of Israel. We will look at my experience as a participant over 16 years ago and as a staff member up until the recent pandemic, the incredible impact that this is having on the Jewish diaspora and the Israeli economy, and the controversy of the program itself. Let's get into it. For those of you who are unaware of what Taglit-Birthright is, it's a program that was created a number of years ago to try and engage young Jewish people in the diaspora with the state of Israel. Many people who were living in the diaspora really had very little connection to Israel and didn't really know much about it, and a number of philanthropists try and find ways to engage these young people with a trip. These trips are usually 10 days where young Jewish people are able to go and explore Israel, the various facets that makes it an amazing country, and be able to meet other fellow Jews along with Israelis and learn sort of what it is to be an Israeli today. About 16 years ago, the topic of Birthright Israel was one you would never really hear in the Jewish community. It was fairly new. I believe it was 2006, so it was only around for a few years at this point. And someone approached me and told me about this, trip to Israel and that it's free. I'll be honest, I'm kind of the typical diaspora Jew where, I grew up in a culturally Jewish area. I wasn't very religious. Most of my friends weren't very religious. I knew of a country called Israel. I really had very little interest in going. It was really interesting because I remember specifically landing in Israel and saying to myself, okay, just 9.5 more days and then I get to go home. I really honestly didn't care to be there. It was, something that I kind of got convinced to do, but really wasn't that interested. That was for about 24 hours. Once I landed, got off the bus, and started learning about the history, something that I've always been interested in, it blew my mind how much information there was to learn. And from that moment forward, it really changed my life. I tried to absorb every possible piece of information from my tour guide. I learned so much that I had no idea about my own history and the history of my people. By the time my trip ended and my life had been essentially changed, I honestly was feeling like I needed to go back. I actually did go back pretty quickly afterwards to go and explore on my own. For anyone who has gone on the Birthright Israel trip, you realize it's like a crazy whirlwind where you sort of get a little taste of every aspect they can try and give you, but you don't really get to go in depth too much into any one particular thing. I spent a month in Israel just exploring and learning as much as I could, visiting places I hadn't seen the first time and going back to places I already had seen. Being a lover of history, one cannot understate how incredible of a country this is, that there is so much history around. And finally, when I returned home, I really felt that I needed to continue my learning. I actually ended up trying to do some studying on my own, and eventually I got into university to study Jewish history and biblical studies because I just couldn't get enough information. A number of years later, I ended up meeting with some people from Birthright who suggested that I try and lead trips, and I always wanted to give back to the same program that had changed my life in such a dramatic way. As a leader, I just honestly loved being able to impart some of the knowledge that I had learned and wanted to know when I was in Israel. I took really a great pride in trying to connect these young people to the state that I had once been connected to by my leaders. And one of my goals was always to get to know my participants as best I could in order to try and make sure that they were able to see the side of Israel that would most interest them. And I felt honestly that I was able to relive my first experience in Israel through them. I got to see the tears at the Western Wall. I got to really honestly get to see the amazement on people's faces when they got into the Dead Sea for the first time and could float. One of my most memorable moments, which honestly I don't think I ever would have expected, was when you go to the Western Wall. Anyone who's been there knows that there are very often on the men's side a group of men who are trying to ask if you'd like to put on tefillin. And I remember specifically, these guys are very, very good. If you've ever been there, they can pick you off from a mile with your Taglit name tag. This man comes out and he's a very cheerful and happy and excited man. And he says, hey, Mike. He could see and he can read my tag. And at first it was kind of off-putting. I didn't realize, like, does this man know who I am? And then I realized he had read my name tag. But he asked me, he's like, oh, you're here on Birthright. How's it going? How's your trip? And how are your participants? And I said to him, like, look, I enjoy it. I love teaching. You just never know until after the fact how you've affected your participants, if they're really getting it, if they're really enjoying it, making it as best an experience as it could be. And he told me a story that has never left my mind. And he said there was a very famous incident with the Rebbe from the Chabad sect. And the Rebbe went out once to speak in front of a crowd, and someone had to break the news to the Rebbe that unfortunately only one person showed up, and maybe it's not worth going out and speaking. And the Rebbe apparently said, I'm not only speaking to this person, I'm speaking to this person and their children and their children's children. And I don't know why in that moment, standing at the Western Wall in front of this amazing, amazing place, I broke into tears, because it affected me that I realized sometimes that I had been leading, let's say hundreds of people to Israel and reconnect them with their Judaism and with the state. But I never thought of the long-term impact that I'd be having on the Jewish community as a whole. That's a very awe-inspiring feeling, and that story has never left me. I remember it to this day. I'm even really proud to know that some of my participants who've been on my trips have actually gone on to become leaders themselves. And unfortunately, as I am passing on the torch to them, I know that the impact I've had on them is going to continue to people that they will lead. And honestly, my heart is full. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the funding for this amazing program and maybe some cool facts that some people don't know about the Birthright Israel program, when the Jewish Diaspora Report continues.